of this specific meeting between President from the Philippines, Duterte, and President Xi from China. How much of it, Professor, from the Philippines, is it about the South China Sea? That just asked that way.
Well, first of all, let me say that for the past few months during our interviews, we discussed this possibility that actually Duterte will visit China among his first state visits. And this is actually his first major state visit, which is unprecedented because other Filipino presidents tend to go first to Washington or perhaps to Tokyo before going to a place like China. So this says a lot about how China is at the top of the pecking order of Duterte's strategic priorities. Now, I think this trip, in terms of optics, has been excellent. It has gone a long way in breaking the ice in frosty bilateral relationship. And I think it has injected a lot of normalization into bilateral ties. And if you look at the discussion, President Duterte has been focused more so far on economics. You have $13.5 billion of business deals, around $3 billion of possible Chinese infrastructure investment in the Philippines. You may have reduction of Chinese restrictions on Filipino imports. That's why he brought big tycoons with himself. But there seems to be also some discussion on the South China Sea disputes. But so far, we're getting conflicting information from the Philippine government.
Professor Heydarian, let's just make comments directly. We heard from President Duterte when he was speaking to the business community and the local community in China from the Philippines. He said that he is not going to bring up the South China Sea issue on his own first. He said this is the respect in Asian culture we have for the host. Later we heard, Professor Heydarian, from the Chinese Vice Minister of Foreign Relations, Mr. Liu Zhemin. He said this: Coast Guards and fishery cooperation has been agreed upon by the two leaders. He did not answer any question regarding fishermen from the Philippines, any possibility to fish near the Huangyan Islands, which is the controversial issue. So what do you make of the specific talk so far?
Well, first of all, when it comes to Duterte, sometimes he tries to play to different audiences. So when he was in Manila a few days ago, he said he's going to raise the issue, and to make sure that the discussion of South China Sea will be within the framework of the Philippine arbitration case. Once he landed in Beijing, he's sounding a little bit different. I think that was out of respect. I think he really appreciates the amount of respect and goodwill that the Chinese leaders have shown him. So he felt it was a little bit disrespectful, or it's going to slight his host. That's why he said that. But from what I know, based on reports and based on my different contacts, it seems behind the scenes there have actually been negotiations on a joint fishery agreements in the Scarborough Shoal to allow the Filipino fishermen to also have access there. This is very politically important because Duterte cannot just go home with economic goodies. He also has to show to the Filipino people that he's going to get also some good compromise in the South China Sea. I even heard that there could be a discussion of a joint oil exploration in the Reed Bank. But it seems the president doesn't want to talk about those things too much. Perhaps he feels they're too controversial and he doesn't want to rock the boat.
All right, let me go to you, Mr. Ye here in Beijing. What about the fact that both leaders have agreed, as being expressed to the media, that the South China Sea is not the sum total of the two countries' relationship? What does that tell us about the realizations from both sides, about the nature of relations in the past 1 or 2 years, and their possible future ahead?
For the last 3 years, we know the China and the Philippine bilateral relation only focusing on one thing, the South China Sea. And let's verify what is going on. Nothing happened. Neither China nor Philippines could say, okay, through this argument, China or Philippines got what they want. It's far away. So this time, for the visit of the President Duterte to China, I think China was not expecting Duterte won't mention the South China Sea issue. It's not our Chinese stance. I think we can talk, we can discuss, we can hold our opinion, we can agree to disagree. So this naturally. But the question is that, do we only have one thing to talk about? Obviously, there's many issues we can explore. So that's the question to answer. That's the answer to answer. What's the priority for the current bilateral relation?
And what is the priority, Mr. Ye?
I think in my understanding that we should look beyond the South China Sea issue. There is a many issue such as the cooperation, the economic cooperation, such as the OBOR initiatives, and such as the Philippines' demand and China's capability to boost the bilateral contacts. So there's many things. Key point is that both sides need to realize only arguing on the South China Sea won't make the situation better.
What about the other area, the trade? And of course, you heard from the Filipino president, Duterte, clearly, commercial alliance. Alliance is a big word to be
really big
used.
word.
By the way, of course, that's coming from the Filipino president. What do you make of that specific phrase, briefly from you? And then I go to our Filipino president.
In a matter of fact, actually, China and the Philippines has been to the commercial alliance for a very long time. Even during the dispute on the South China Sea, still these two countries hold very tight commercial relations. So that means a lot. It doesn't mean we have to stay on the South China Sea issue and then go anything else. We can't do the things at the same time.
Well, can we do the same thing at the same time? Let's see some of the numbers, as you said, Mr. Ye, that the trade relations has always been a very important part. China is Philippines' top source for imports, second largest trading partner, and also the third largest export market. Even when political relations between the two sides soured last year, the economic ties remained warm. Bilateral trade in 2015 hit over $45.6 billion, a 2.7% increase still in the year 2015, despite the disputes then a year earlier. So, what do you make of it, Professor Heydarian, in the Philippines? Is that trade relationship likely to lead us to what your president called a commercial alliance? What would that mean?
Well, I mean, first thing first, you're correct to say that the volume of trade has remained substantial despite all the acrimony over the South China Sea disputes. But the terms of the trade actually have deteriorated. It used to be, the Philippines used to have a smaller trade deficit with China. So now the trade deficit has increased. That's why during his trip, President Duterte brought a lot of Filipino businessmen so that the Philippines can also gain more access to China's consumer market, which is one of the biggest in the world. The second thing is investments. China's share of investments, foreign direct investment stock, is less than 1%, while the US is 13% and Japan is even way more. So there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of Chinese investments, particularly in the realm of infrastructure. This is where Duterte's heart is. He wants China to help the Philippines to develop its infrastructure, particularly in his home island of Mindanao. So expect a lot of Chinese projects starting in the Philippines, perhaps in the coming months or not years. And of course, if China enters the Philippine infrastructure market, that puts pressure on Japan and other countries to also be more competitive. So Duterte, because of this trip, has made the Philippine infrastructure landscape more promising. So that's why the stakes were very high in terms of bilateral economic relations, even if the volume of trade has not been compromised by the South China Sea disputes.
3 billion, that is the number being signed at this time between the two countries, come to China's provision of possibility support for infrastructure building inside the Philippines. But that, of course, is the loan. It's nothing else, it's the loan. How much sign does it give us as to China's competitiveness into the Filipino infrastructure market?
I think China has
Is it going to push others out of the market?
I don't think the Philippines market is so small, only for $3 billion. Actually, it's a huge market. So I think the Philippines market could open to all the countries who has the intention and capacity to put investment. Question is that China left behind due to the obvious reason, the South China Sea dispute. So if we are talking about FDI or infrastructure construction, for the last couple of years, China is left behind. Now China could catch up, although there is still something uncertain. For instance, the South China Sea dispute is still there. The two countries' stance is quite far away. But the question is that now the two countries can manage this dispute and then leave their a very huge space room for the two countries to focusing on the economy, cooperation, and coordination. So I think this does not necessarily means China would keep another country out. Obviously, after all, 3 billion is not a big number.
Okay, talking about other countries, we are not just focusing on the political and economic tie between China and the Philippines, because there are other players in the region and beyond. The United States, Professor Heydarian, is one of those obvious countries we have to mention. There seems to be, according to President Duterte, some very obvious remarks he wants to have Washington heard. He said that during his trip to China that he will not go to the United States because he said once he go there, the Filipinos would only be quote unquote insulted. What do you make of the remarks like this? Does it in any way show President Duterte's determined policies already toward Washington?
I don't think so. I think the thing with President Duterte is that he says a lot of things, and sometimes they're more bravado and braggadocio. I mean, let's remember, President Obama is stepping down in coming months. This is his final 100 days. So there's no reason for Duterte to think about going to US unless we know who's going to be the next American president, and whether it's Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, that represents its own matrix of calculations for the Philippines to consider. But remember, in 5 days, he's going to visit Japan also, which is the #1 ally of the United States, and expect Japan also to put a lot of economic incentives on the table to counterbeat China. So in fairness to Duterte, he has created this very dynamic competition among major economic powers to fight over the Philippine goodwill and the Philippine infrastructure landscape. So some very interesting dynamic things happening there. And the other thing is this, he says a lot of things about severing ties with the US, ending the alliance with the US, goodbye to the US, but so far we have not even gotten a confirmation that bilateral exercises with the US will be canceled. So sometimes we have to take his statements with a grain of salt.
Well, at this moment, Professor Heydarian, during his visit to China, there is a demonstration going on in front of the U.S. Embassy inside Manila about the Filipino people demanding the U.S. out of Mindanao, which is an important place for President Duterte to begin with. Is there likely to be an upswing trend politically inside the Philippines as a result of whether the remarks or the actions coming from the president?
Well, Duterte is a very popular president. More than 80% of people have expressed trust and confidence in him. Nonetheless, despite his dust-ups with the United States, it seems that America is still very popular in the Philippines. A survey came out yesterday that showed America has a positive net 66% approval rating in the Philippines. So it seems by and large the Filipinos still have a positive view of the United States. And these protests, while getting a lot of media coverage because of some unfortunate incident involving the police cracking down on them, they're relatively small. They're not actually that large. So Duterte is actually going against the public opinion here by trying to reach out to China. And Duterte is trying very hard to portray China as a positive partner for peace for the Philippines.
What do you make of this apparent Filipino president leaving or trying to distancing away from Washington, at least for the moment?
Very frankly speaking, I think this question should ask American. It's American should think about his attitude to one of his major alliance in the Southeast Asia.
We're going to ask an American expert later after our conversation.
That's the question is that I don't think Duterte is only because of his he want to make the balance on the South China Sea issue or try to get better his relationship with China. It's also because of American takes a very, very negative towards the president himself. So in this case, for the China's perspective, I think we would like to see Philippine and the U.S. relation remain stable. That means no any unexpected accident happen. But we also would like to see American could a little bit adjust his attitude to his alliance and also another ASEAN, maybe not very strong country, but still a very important country for the whole region's stability and the peace.
Well, the the country itself is going to be very important. ASEAN chair, likely 2017. That is going to be the Philippines' rotating presidency. Come back to you, Professor Heydarian.
Yes.
What is it? I mean, for this, what some consider as abrupt change of foreign policy by the Filipino government after President Duterte comes into office toward the United States. Is it political shrewdness? Is it political belief against the West? Or is it a very smart adjustment about what he believes the future is?
I think it's definitely a combination of all those factors. I think Duterte personally has reservations with US. He calls himself a socialist. He has some anti-imperialist kind of mindset that has been there for a long time. he had some bad experiences with the US when he was the mayor of Davao. That's one thing. The second thing is very irritated with Americans' criticism of his war on drugs, on human rights conditions. He feels the US has no business to criticize him so openly, so publicly. But thirdly, there's also a matter of strategic recalibration, because under the previous president for Duterte, the Philippines was too much in the American camp. So now Duterte is trying to bring the Philippines a little bit more to the center. So while Duterte is making a wild swing in terms of rhetoric, in actuality, the Philippines is moving actually more to the center, whereby it can equibalance between the two superpowers. I think that is where most likely the Philippines will end up if we really try to scratch below the surface and not to be overwhelmed by Duterte's often headline-grabbing statements.
Not just rhetorics, but also exact actions. Of course, that's important. Mr. Ye, Chinese President Xi Jinping, when he was meeting with President Duterte from the Philippines, he used this word: China and the Philippines are brothers. And he said, of course, the relations between the two should not be revered by some of the recent events. Having said that, though, what kind of nature do you think the Chinese believe its relationship with the Philippines? Will the two countries be able to mend their fences as if nothing have happened before? Will bad feelings still remain? How long will they remain? Or actually, it's going to be a totally new page?
No, I don't think it's a totally new page. Question is that why the President Duterte can decide the foreign policy doctrine of the Philippines for a very long time. There's many different interest group and lobbyist group in Philippines, and all this has a very influential and a very strong foreign background. So it's not it's very difficult to say President Duterte can hold his foreign policy for how long to the end of his term. But also we should notice that for China, Philippines never is China's major threat. We have the problem, we have the dispute with Philippines, but Philippines is not the Chinese rival. And only when the Philippines choose a side of the American alliance and fighting for American interest, there will be a Chinese problem. And there will be serious impact to the bilateral relation. Otherwise, only the South China Sea dispute. For the last half a century, China and the Philippines has this issue, but we managed pretty well.
All right. Before we go, another very important set of questions, that is, what about the Philippines' role in the Southeast Asia? As I said, Professor Heydarian, Philippine chair for ASEAN 2017. Philippines also, some consider, did its job during the APEC summit 2015. So with adjustment of foreign policy, at least apparently, how is Philippines going to be viewed by its ASEAN neighbors, therefore play its role?
Yeah. Well, I mean, without a question, some Asian neighbors also have been quite scandalized by some of Duterte's expletives and some of his bravado and braggadocio. But I think largely the ASEAN as a whole appreciated the fact that President Duterte had a much more, I would say, pragmatic approach to the South China Sea. Unlike his predecessor, who was more of a China hawk and pressuring ASEAN to adopt a stronger position against China. So now that the Philippines is taking up the chairmanship of the ASEAN and other regional fora, I think now the Philippines is moving actually to the center, to the consensus among majority of ASEAN countries who believe that bilateral engagement and dialogue is, at the end of the day, the best way forward. So in that sense, actually, Duterte is much closer to the consensus of the rest of the ASEAN than his predecessor.
Mr. Ye, also final words from you before we go. 2017, very important year. New president of the United States comes into power. China also going to experience an important political year. The Philippines become the ASEAN chair. All of these combined, what would that mean?
Very short term, that China will and would respect the Philippines speak on behalf of themselves and also on behalf of the ASEAN because he is the chair. But if Philippines, just like the Duterte's predecessor, speak on behalf of another country's interest, it will be the problem.